A male Cape May Warbler is the subject of this small 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor painting. I did this on a block of Kilimanjaro cold pressed paper, which I've really been enjoying working on. It takes a wash beautifully, but isn't as rough as some cold pressed papers, so it still takes detail quite well. Unfortunately, I managed to have a recording failure on the opening washes, so I'll be picking up partway through the process of blocking in the background. The opening wash that was missed was done wet on wet. I had pre-mixed 5 different greens using phthalo green and lemon yellow in varying amounts, as well as some other mixes with ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow medium, and cadmium red. My purples were combinations of dioxazine purple with some ultramarine and phthalo blue. The background in my photo reference was mostly green and grayish-white, but I chose to inject some purples as a color opposite to the yellow that will come in later on the bird. With the basic background colors washed in, I started to glaze in some light suggestions of mid-ground branches on dry paper using a number 6 round brush. I re-wet a portion of the paper on the left side and washed in some darker greens, then locked that in with the hairdryer. I continued putting in light suggestions of foliage towards the bottom and added shading to the leaves I'd already had by glazing in some darker layers using a number 2 round brush. It was a humid day and I occasionally hit things with the hairdryer to be sure to lock things onto the paper. Again, I darkened up the left-hand side of the page, this time using a number 8 round brush to scumble in some leafy textures. I hit that with the hairdryer and then removed the frisket, and transferred the foreground portions of my sketch using a tracing paper transfer. Once the lines were in place, I went about painting my general shading onto dry paper. I used a mix of ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple with a sharp number 4 round brush. These unifying shadows should help bring together my foreground elements. Afterwards, I started adding in my lightest local colors for the leaves. I used some of my pre-mixed greens for my background color wells. Next, I painted the bird and branches in their lightest local colors. To push some of the branches back toward the midground, I added some of my background greens. This should help things recede. Most of the painting was done using a number 2 round brush from here out. Those are my go-to detail brush size. I'll wear out one of these about every 5 to 6 paintings. Typically, I'll take out the 10-aught brushes only for the tiniest details like toenails, beaks, and eyes late in the painting. My plan was to have the branch that the bird was perched on fade into the background a bit as it twisted up and off the page. I did this by lowering the amount of saturation, contrast, and detail as it moved back in space. The branch's brown tones were made of various mixes of Indian red, burnt sienna, and yellow ochre, desaturated with dioxazine purple and ultramarine blue. Being right-handed, I keep my water and palettes to the right of my painting so they're easy to reach. I have my photo reference on a laptop that's off to the left and out of the way. I tend to follow my photo references most literally for the bird details more than anything else. Usually I'm reinventing the lighting and backgrounds a lot from what I got in camera. My goal isn't to duplicate the photo, but to kind of change things up and make it more interesting than what I saw. I almost never paint from my best photos. Those stand on their own. I usually am drawn to work on photos that weren't quite right but had potential to be good. That takes a little of the pressure off when you're on a photo trip because if it isn't the perfect photo, that's okay. It can still have a second life when reinvented as a painting. I especially like painting songbirds, especially warblers. Those are almost always found in areas with tons of branches, so it's really hard to get a good, clean image of the bird without some sort of foreground obstruction, a stick or a blurred leaf obscuring part of the bird. If you're painting ducks or raptors and wading birds, well, it's a lot easier to get a clean, clear photo because there isn't much between you and the birds. On the plus side, all those potential obstructions can be really interesting as design elements, and they often give a great sense of depth and scale to a scene. Even if they're more photographically challenging, I think including all those other elements really make for more interesting paintings. My goal at this point was to start blending in my foreground elements with the background and develop some midground. All of this was done by controlling the amount of contrast, detail, and color saturation. White in these transparent watercolor paintings is always the white of the paper, so I need to be careful to spare my highlights by painting around them. You can see from the Butcher's Tray palette how transparent my glazes are. By putting in dozens of overlapping layers of paint, it builds up your textures. I'm always working light to dark as I go. I put in the lightest local color and then glaze darker and darker colors until it's correct. On this one, I really eased into the upper green leaves. In hindsight, I could have charged in with darker colors in the first passes, but I was going cautiously because I wanted some of the leaves to be quite light. I usually don't work much on the birds until later in the painting. For the chestnut colors on the warbler's cheek and neck, I use some chrome orange and burnt sienna for the first passes. The darkest areas had additional glazing with alizarin crimson and dioxazine purple later in the painting. For the dark cap, I used some of my purple browns from the branch mixes. Those were made with dioxazine purple, ultramarine blue, and Indian red. Olives on the bird's back used many of the dark green background mixes I made using phthalo green and cadmium red, as well as mixes with ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, and cadmium red medium. The breast and yellow face colors went in with a base of lemon yellow, with shading and textures brought in with cadmium yellow pale and chrome orange. The blackish feathers were done with the mix of ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple, and Indian red. Later, some sections were darkened further with the mix of phthalo green and alizarin crimson. I like the twisty branch that this guy was perched on. Even though it's just a painting of a single bird, I thought the branch offered a lot of other areas of interest to look at and investigate, while adding motion to the composition. The leaves also added interest because they're kind of fading in and out with the amount of color saturation, contrast, and detail. I thought I was pretty much finished and signed the piece. When I got back to the drafting table after a week of vacation, I thought the background needed a bit more detail above the bird. It was missing some contrast and looked a bit weak. I basically added a bit of darker shading and sharpened up a ton of details on many of those right-hand leaves. Other areas that needed some help were some ambiguous leaves at the bottom of the painting. Again, those got some corrections and added details with darker colors. I felt the left-hand side needed some extra dark, so I faked in a few leafy areas. I added a few more darks using some of my background greens to the bottom edge of the bird's belly and called it quits. This was a fun painting to work on, and it was of one of my favorite warblers. I can't wait to see him again this spring. At the time of making this video, the original painting is still available. I'll put a link to my Etsy shop in the video description. If anyone has interest, I started a newsletter with some watercolor painting tips and other information. A link to sign up for that will also be in the video description. I hope you all get a chance to get out the watercolors soon.